Welcome back, everyone, as we get into episodes 3 and 4 of the Buddhist expansion. Hope you enjoyed the first 2 episodes, and if you are a member or a patron, you're probably watching this a day early. But also wanted to let you know that we are doing a private stream for you guys. It's going to be at 5 p.m. Eastern U.S. time on Saturday. I will be creating that shortly, and I'll post the link on both Patreon and for our members here on YouTube, so you can check that out. Also, if you did not see the first 2 episodes, which was one episode of a reaction, I'll put the link down in the description in addition to the one with the original content. I want to give a shout out and a thank you to Charles Glawe, or Glawa. I don't know how to pronounce your last name. I apologize. Glawe in Columbus, Ohio. Go Buckeyes. Thank you so much for your support. Let's go ahead and dive into episode 3. Strobe lights.
Northeast India, circa 3rd century BCE.
Okay, so for context, we're 200 to 300 years after Buddha's life at this point.
Chamber underneath the stupa has lain undisturbed for 2 centuries, until suddenly, the door seal breaks.
Burial place?
Inside steps King Ashoka, leader of the Maurya Empire, a crown he'd won through murder and an empire built by violence.
To be fair, that's how a lot of crowns are won, right? I mean, murder and violence, it's called right of conquest to win a throne. That's how thrones get won all the time.
But the slaughter of those battles had caused a change in him. Previously a ruthless killer, he's now renounced violence and war in service of another mission, devoting himself to the practice and spread of Buddhism. And he's come here to get his hands on a powerful relic. That is, of course, if he can get by the guards. A flash in the dark, a grind of gears. 2 automatons careen out of the darkness, animated by possessing spirits, their arms spinning blades. Ashoka parries their blows, looking for the arcane workings that will put them under his power. The story claims that when King Ashoka eventually emerged from that burial stupa, the 2 golems were following him as his servants, though they were not the greatest prize. For now he carried in his hands the ashes of the Buddha.
So this is a pretty common thing, too. A king builds his kingship, builds his kingdom, his empire on bloodshed and violence. And now he gets to the place where he's able to consolidate it, and now he wants to have peace. Now he's starting to think about the afterlife. Now he's starting to think about the legacy he wants to leave, and he really wants to be remembered for something different than the bloodshed and violence. It's a common theme throughout history.
Don't forget, as soon as you're done watching this episode, the next episode in this series is already up a week early and ad-free over on Nebula. Besides the Buddha himself, Ashoka the Great may be the most important figure in early Buddhism, because by adopting Buddhism as his court religion, Ashoka fulfilled a similar role as Constantine played.
I was just about to say the parallels with Constantine are all over this.
In Christianity, helping the young religion spread and gain legitimacy. Though before we get more into Ashoka, we should really talk about our goals with this series, because you might have noticed by this point that we've been fairly bare bones about describing Buddhist beliefs. Here, our aim is to chart the foundation, spread, evolution, and historical impact of Buddhism, not to explain every element of Buddhist practice and cosmology.
And that brings me to a point about something that I said in the last episode of this reaction. I was talking a little bit about how we seem to hold religious figures from history to a different standard when it comes to historicity of those people than we do other figures in history. And several people have made the comment, well, that's because there are claims of deity and miracles. Listen, those are separate issues. We're not talking about the claims. Like, we're not talking about, for example, did Jesus really rise from the dead? Did he turn water into wine? Those are separate issues. I'm talking about, did he exist as a person? Did Buddha exist as a person? Not did these miracles and these apparitions and these sorts of things happen. Separate conversations. We should hold religious figures to the same standard when it comes to their veracity as historical figures as we do anyone else. The religion aspect is a different, and so I'm glad that they're making that distinction here as well.
Because I'm just gonna be honest, y'all. Buddhism is often just really hard to explain. Heck, even religious scholars and lifelong Buddhists can struggle to understand certain concepts or texts.
That's true of any religion, right? I mean, Christianity, try explaining the Trinity. You know, I went to school for Bible and theology. I've been a pastor my entire adult life. I can't explain it. There are certain things that everybody has an opinion on, everybody has different views on, everybody's explanation of it is different. Everybody, you know, even within a religion, there are thousands of different views and interpretations of things.
Case in point, Rob has a degree in religion and some background in Buddhism, yet his brain practically melted while researching this. For example,
That's fair.
Does Buddhism have a god? Well, no. There is no creator deity. The world just exists in an endless cycle, driven by a chain of causal relationships. Okay, then who are Buddhists praying to when they venerate statues of the Buddha? Well, technically, the answer is no one. Buddha's achieved nirvana, so he gone. But he gave you the tools to achieve enlightenment, and you have to do the rest yourself. Meaning the veneration of Buddha images is partially just gratitude, partially to use it as a focal point for your own self-development, and partially in hopes that offerings and chants will build merit that lead to better rebirths. But wait, hold on again. Don't people call on celestial beings and bodhisattvas for things like healing? Also, isn't there Yama, the god of death? Well, yes, I mean, depending on what branch of Buddhism we're talking about and how it fused with local traditions, and yeah, you can kind of see how this can just become a nesting doll of explanations and caveats if we're not careful.
And listen, like I said, let's not stick that solely on Buddhism. That's true for any religion.
So as a result, we're trying to focus on the basic tenets. Partially for our sake, of course, but also because when Buddhism spread, it was often these simpler teachings that people adopted. Sure, monks dove into the more esoteric subjects, of course, but the average person largely approached it as a practical moral system to guide their lives. Which does circle us nicely back to King Ashoka, one of the greatest monarchs of world history who had been largely forgotten until the 19th century. In 1836, an East India Company officer named James Princip deciphered an ancient script used on dozens of rock and pillar monuments across India, some of which contained other languages such as Aramaic and Greek. Meaning that over the next 2 years...
So that's actually really a lot like the Rosetta Stone. The whole reason we're able to... One of the reasons, it was one of the main factors in deciphering hieroglyphics, is that you had this Rosetta Stone that was in multiple languages, and because we could read the other languages, we could decipher what the third one said. So Aramaic and Greek, very widely spoken languages in that part of the world. Well, not that far east, but like in Jesus' time, for example, Jesus' first language would have been Aramaic, but he almost certainly would have been able to speak Greek as well. Greek is what the New Testament's written in. A lot of the Old Testament is either written in Hebrew or in Aramaic. So these are languages that if you can read those, then you can interpret the last one.
Years, he was able to translate and read the incredible story those monuments contained. And the story they told, once they pieced together several honorific names, realizing the monuments were all commissioned by the same man, was that of a converted king. 8 years into Ashoka's reign, he finally conquered the Kalinga region, making him the first to control nearly all of the Indian peninsula, as well as parts of what is now Afghanistan and Bangladesh.
So this is another great example of how history can change based on new discoveries. I don't know how much we knew about Ashoka before this discovery, but obviously a lot of what we know comes because of that. And so I think I made a comment to somebody yesterday quoting Carl Sagan when I said, somebody said, well, we don't have any evidence of this particular event, therefore it didn't happen. And I quoted Carl Sagan, who said, absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence of absence. It just means we haven't found the evidence yet. A lot of times we find evidence of things that we previously thought were myths or didn't happen or didn't really exist, people we didn't think really existed, and then one day we find something like, oh my gosh, they really did exist. So history is always changing, or at least our understanding of history is always changing.
His empire included Greek and Aramaic-speaking minorities, and according to his inscriptions and certain mentions in Greek texts, he appears to have exchanged ambassadors with the Hellenistic world, sending representatives to Alexandria, Macedon, and other Greek kingdoms. His stone inscriptions, the first found in India, actually appear to be imports from the Achaemenid Empire of Persia. and it's been suggested he actually imported Persian stonemasons to do the carvings, which explains why his personal symbol of the lion looks so Persian in style.
Yeah.
By the way, those carvings became so famous that the lions from his pillars became part of the seal of modern India, and his symbol of the wheel is on their flag. Yeah, he's kind of a big deal. Yet, according to the oldest rock inscriptions, it was at the scene of his final conquest that his reign took a drastic turn. Turns out, the conquest of Kalinga had sickened him, and the 10,000 men he'd killed in battle, not to mention more civilians, began to finally weigh heavy on his conscience. So within the next 2 years, Ashoka gradually converted to Buddhism and decided to govern his empire on Buddhist principles, which caused him to fully renounce violence. Buddhist legend tells that before this conversion, Ashoka was a real, over-the-top cartoon-style villain. He just loved killing everyone in various itchy and scratchy kind of ways.
Kind of like the serial killer with the fingers around his neck from yesterday's episode.
Including, supposedly, 99 of his half-brothers to take the actual throne. Of course, much like Buddha's robot tomb guardians from the beginning of this episode, these legends come from hundreds of years after his death and are almost certainly fictional. However, we don't want to totally trust his inscriptions either, since they probably contain at least an element of propaganda. So,
it's true with anything. We say this all the time. Anytime you're dealing with something that was written down in history, you have to consider the source. How close is the source to the actual events? What is their point in writing that down? Are they trying to send a particular message? Are they making a point? Are they taking a side? What is their bias? All of it has to be factored in.
Just keep all that in mind, you know? Spin from both directions and all that. According to his inscriptions, Ashoka founded monasteries and built stupas all over his territory, including some at major sites of the Buddha's life. In fact, we mostly know about the locations of Siddhartha's life from these monuments built 200 years after his death. These include pillars at the site of Buddha's birthplace, his first sermon, and the location of the Bodhi tree, where Ashoka also built a stone throne on the site of Siddhartha's enlightenment. He also went on the hunt for relics, excavating...
Again, this is so much like Constantine, right? Constantine converts the Roman Empire to Christianity. He goes on hunts for relics. He starts building churches, commemorates places like, the tomb of the Holy Sepulchre, builds this church on the site of the crucifixion and the burial. All of this stuff is just like this.
Buddha's original burial stupa, and supposedly finding 7 of the 8 portions of Buddha's ashes before apportioning them to monasteries across India. But he spread more than relics. Many of his religious inscriptions contain basic summaries of Buddhist ethics. Ashoka would send officials to gather the local populations around these monuments and read them aloud to spread Buddhist principles. However, Ashoka's campaign of religious diffusion was also practical. His inscriptions stated an official policy of religious toleration, and he gave money to non-Buddhist sects. Not to mention, the Buddhist inscriptions were generally focused on the here and now, how governing the empire along Buddhist principles and the people adopting Buddhist morals themselves would improve his subjects' lives.
Again, like Constantine, using Christianity to unite the nation and to, and a lot of, so many times throughout history, I'm mostly familiar with European and Christian history, religion has been used as a means of uniting or even controlling the people. Napoleon understood this. Napoleon himself would embrace whatever religion was native to the people where he was. So if it was Egypt, it was Islam. If it was Italy, it was Catholicism. He wasn't necessarily a Muslim or a Catholic himself, but he understood the importance of those religions to those people. And so he embraced them as a way of helping control, helping unite, helping pacify.
They emphasized compassion for all creatures and respect for family. He also instituted what we'd call today infrastructure policies. Ashoka sent cuttings of medical plants across his empire, so each community would have access to a botanical garden of healing spices and plants. He ordered banyan trees, mango groves, and wells placed along the roadside to provide food, water, and shelter for travelers. And crucially, he abolished the death penalty. But his most radical act actually involved animals. Ashoka ceased hunting, ordered that animal sacrifices stop, that his royal kitchens phase out meat, and established medical facilities specifically to treat animals. Actually, he disavowed the killing of certain animals entirely, which are considered some of the first environmental protection laws. I know, right? Here's where things get contentious, though. See, those laws that centered around the disallowing of animal sacrifices could be seen as directly targeting Brahmanism, the proto-Hinduism the majority of his subjects practiced. This, along with Buddhism's anti-caste system mentality, were pretty radical moves back in the day. Though, honestly, they are actually still controversial in the majority Hindu modern India, which tend to downplay these more radically Buddhist qualities in order to shape Ashoka into a more unifying nationalist figure. And though you don't want to trust legends entirely, Buddhist tales about him suggest these restrictions on traditional Brahmin practices, like sacrifice, were not taken well even then. After 40 years of rule, including a 30-year stretch considered the most peaceful in the region's history, it's said that Ashoka's sons got sick of their father's religious policies and huge donations to monasteries. They deposed him, but he kept on making donations in emulation of the Buddha. His last act,
Good for him.
just before dying, was to give away his final possession, a half piece of fruit. But despite his unification of much of India, his internal spread of Buddhism, and all his social programs, and fighting those robots, it was said that his greatest pride came from the missionaries he sent abroad. Ashoka's envoys had spread Buddhism as far as Sri Lanka, which still looks at him as a founding figure, and they would go...
Well, yeah, I mean, and then later on, obviously, we have the Silk Road that is going to run through that, and trading routes are the primary means through which you spread things. I mean, that's even true when you play Civilization. If you play Civilization and you build a trading route between you and another culture, you can spread your culture, you can spread your religion by doing that, and that's how Buddhism spread.
Much further still, into the rice fields and spice islands of Southeast Asia, triggering artistic innovation, religious melding, war, and games of Capture the Buddha.
All right, let's go ahead and dive right into part 4.
City-state of Chiang Rai, Thailand, 1434.
Oh wow, we really moved forward.
Lightning arcs down, crashing into the monastery stupa. Stone explodes, brick dust fills the air, and when the abbot goes to inspect the damage, he finds a luminous green statue, the famed Emerald Buddha. Supposedly made in India 1500 years before, it had been taken to Sri Lanka to save it from civil war, then to Angkor Wat, then it was captured by a Thai army who hid it in this stupa, I guess. Rare and beautiful, possession of it granted an almost mythical legitimacy to any ruler. So, naturally, the abbot
Parallels with the Ark of the Covenant.
king wanted it sent to his capital in Chiang Mai. But the elephant carrying it stubbornly went to another city instead. And figuring that it was a divine message, it resided there for 32 years before the next king did in fact move it to Chiang Mai. But then an
Wonder if it's there to this day. I know some people who lived in Chiang Mai.
earthquake toppled the stupa it was housed in. So in 1552, a visiting prince decided to take the Buddha back with him to Laos. But then the capital of Laos was raided by the Burmese, and the prince evacuated the Buddha to yet another city. There it stayed for 200 years until a Thai general looted it and took it to Bangkok, where it does, in fact, remain today.
Oh, okay.
At least until
in Bangkok.
Someone captures it again.
Interesting.
Thanks so much to Factor for keeping us well fed on a busy schedule. Now, you might be asking, why start the episode with that overly complicated story of the Emerald Buddha? Well, legendary origins in India aside, its journey actually provides a pretty good snapshot of how Buddhism spread through Southeast Asia. Originating in northern India, Buddhism spread to Sri Lanka during Ashoka's reign, then out into Cambodia, Thailand, and Burma, present-day Myanmar. And once there, Buddhism would not only be present as beliefs and practices, but as a form of royal legitimacy that underpinned the political order. It's a story that starts in Sri Lanka, a kingdom that, according to Sri Lankan Buddhist tradition, was supposedly converted when Ashoka sent his son and daughter to the island to make it a new capital of faith. Buddhism in Sri Lanka would take on its own character, evolving into a localized belief system that came to believe that it, rather than India, was the center of the Buddhist world.
Not uncommon for religions to take on a particularly local flavor. The idea of congregationalism, as it exists in the United States with Christianity, would be foreign to a lot of other parts of the world. The idea that a congregation, for example, can own its own property and choose its own pastor and elect its own leaders rather than them being appointed by a bishop or by the denomination. That would be very foreign in a lot of other places. But in the United States, where we're all about electing our leaders and democracy, it has kind of blended into Christianity that way.
Also, it was a very specific kind of Buddhism that they practiced, Theravada. Early in the Buddhist movement, generally dated around the time of the Second Buddhist Council, Buddhism began to experience schism. If you'll remember, Buddha gave his teachings orally.
Inevitably, this happens in religion. Why does this happen in religion? Because people are human beings and we're selfish and we want what we want. And if we don't like something, we change it. And then the people who don't like the change we made are going to stick with the original until they make their own changes. And, no matter whether something is divinely inspired or not, as soon as humans get their grubby little fingers on it, we just twist it and mess it all up.
And they were supposedly only written down decades after his death, though some scholars claim this was actually more like a few centuries. This meant that once the Buddhist scriptures were written down in the Pali language of the region, enough time had passed that there were differing interpretations on what was known as the Pali canon. Adding to that, varying schools developed their own commentaries on these scriptures, leading to more divergent beliefs. Some of Ashoka's rock edicts even feature laws against schism, showing that he tried to prevent the religion from further splintering, especially for his favorite tradition, the Theravada, meaning School of the Elders. Now today, Theravada is the only one of these early traditions still practiced, and it adheres to the type of Buddhism we've discussed in past episodes. As you can probably guess from the name, it's conservative, stressing adherence to the Pali Canon, reverence for what they see as the historical Siddhartha Gautama, and asserts that one attains nirvana through practice as a Buddhist monk. Meanwhile, other traditions that we'll discuss in episode 5, like Mahayana, have a few other options.
So it's kind of, basically saying we're going back to the roots, to the heart, to what this originally was meant to be. In Christianity, there's something called the Restoration Movement, which is the same concept, that 1,800 years of Christianity have so warped the church that we need to fix it back to what it was originally. I'm sure that Islam and Judaism and other religions have similar ideas.
Though Theravada lost its tradition of nuns for reasons that are still unclear. Some stories claim that in the 10th through 12th centuries, northern India, Sri Lanka, and Burma were hit by several waves of foreign invasions, including the Mongols, which wiped out so many nuns that few existed to train the next generation. But it's probably not quite that simple. It more likely had to do with how Buddhism changed in order to adapt to Southeast Asian audiences, which is something it is uniquely good at. Buddhism is a shapeshifter, as a religion that came from the same melting pot as Hinduism, which would be a vegetarian melting pot, just to be clear. Buddhism shared many of its beliefs like reincarnation and karma. That meant Buddhism was good at living side by side with Hinduism, to the point that where they coexisted, the two tended to borrow elements from each other. And if an area had previously converted to Hinduism, it made it fertile ground for Buddhist conversion. Hinduism had already made it out to mainland Southeast Asia, as well as the Indonesian islands, via the trade routes. Ships from Sri Lanka carried Indian cotton to Indonesia in exchange for
If you want to understand history, we talked recently about looking at history through narrow lenses, looking at history through finance, looking at history through religion. Trade's another one of those lenses we can use to get a particular view of how history has evolved.
Spice and kingdoms in Thailand sold ritual objects like bronze drums to middlemen traders who took them to India. Frequently, the merchant families that sailed these routes actually settled a wing of their family there, usually a younger brother and his wife, to work as an agent. That way, the resident agent could buy goods when they were cheapest and hold them until the family ship arrived to take them on. And these merchant settlers developed small communities and built Buddhist temples. Meanwhile, monks still traveled to spread the message of enlightenment, adapting it to the local culture and region. And we can especially see this adaptation in bodhisattvas, figures believed to be future Buddhas, spiritually powerful individuals who will eventually become enlightened. Bodhisattvas function in Buddhism in a vaguely similar way like saints do in Catholicism. So Buddhism adopted local gods or heroes as bodhisattvas, incorporating elements of Vishnu, Shiva, or legendary kings into them in order to help appeal to local tastes. This melding resulted in a type of Theravada Buddhism.
And again, I can think of examples of the exact same thing happening from Christianity. There's a story in the book of Acts where Paul, I forget which city he's in. He's in one of the cities in kind of what used to be Greece, in the Greek Empire, probably somewhere in either Greece or Turkey today. And he's speaking to a crowd there, and they have a statue to an unknown god. And he says, I can tell you who this unknown god is. And he uses what their culture already understood and then uses that as an avenue to introduce Christianity to them. He talks about how he has become all things to all people so that by all means he might convert some of them. So, to a vegetarian, I become a vegetarian so that I can convert some vegetarians, those kinds of things. Not that he's necessarily lying or pretending to be something he's not. What he's saying is I try to understand their culture and how the message that I bring fits within the context of the world they understand. Same thing happening here.
Buddhism in mainland Southeast Asia that largely stuck to its roots when it came to monastic life and core beliefs, but took on a distinct flavor when it came to art, folktales, and performance. Though things were a bit different in the Indonesian islands. There, Hinduism had rooted itself deep, and Buddha never gained a total conversion. So instead, he joined the Hindu pantheon to form a syncretic religion known as Hindu Buddhism. And if you're interested in that, we actually went into this a bit in our series on Majapahit, which you can watch here. Though, to be clear, it was not all coexistence. At Angkor Wat, which we also have a series on, man, we do a lot of shows, Buddhism left a mark, quite literally, with a chisel. Originally a Hindu temple complex, later Buddhist rulers would deface the Shiva imagery and install Buddhist statues in its place. And those Buddhist kings felt they were absolutely right to do so because Buddhism also brought a new style of monarchy to Southeast Asia.
And we've seen this also with other religions. Look at the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. It's built on the site of the earlier Jewish temples, which were built on the site where it was said that Abraham offered his son Isaac, was going to offer his son Isaac as a sacrifice on that rock. All of that in the same place. The Hagia Sophia is a mosque today, and it was originally built as this massive church for Christianity. As other cultures and other religions come in, they just adopt what's already there.
The concept of a righteous king. Stories of Ashoka's deeds were never forgotten in Buddhism, and he became a model for both judging future monarchs and understanding how power should be wielded to create a Buddhist society. The kings of Thailand, Burma, and Cambodia were not quite god kings, but they did cloak themselves in an air of Buddhist righteousness that made them semi-religious figures worthy of veneration. These kings, many of whom spent at least some time in a monastery living as monks before their coronation, ruled from palaces filled with temples and shrines, having monks as part of their court. Some in the Middle Ages invited monks from as far away as the Himalayas to instruct them in secret rituals meant to increase their power, with a few kings even believed to have supernatural abilities. And these beliefs still exist today. In fact, when Rob last visited Cambodia, a tour guide told him that the body of the current king is iron hard and cannot be cut with blades, that he's cool even in the extreme heat, and he was allowed by the Chinese authorities to sit on the throne of the Forbidden City, which, just to be clear, definitely did not happen. This idea of a Buddhist state ramped up even higher in the colonial period, when countries like Thailand, Myanmar, and Cambodia turned to the religion as a unifying force that helped define what it meant to be Thai, Cambodian, or Burmese. And Buddhist nationalism proved a major component in resisting and throwing off foreign rule, from monks holding nonviolent protests to assisting in the self-conception of newly independent nations. However, this has also had an ugly knock-on effect that continues into the present day. Some governments like Sri Lanka and Myanmar that consider Buddhism an intrinsic part of their national character have often clashed with religious minorities. Sri Lanka denied Tamil Hindu citizenship, helping lead to a civil war that ended only in 2009.
Wow.
While in Myanmar, the government has killed 25,000 Muslims and driven over 1 million into refugee camps in neighboring countries.
And this just goes to show you, I mean, I'm a little bit familiar with some of that stuff that has gone on, but by and large, this is not stuff that gets talked a lot about on the news in the West here. We focus very heavily on things like Ukraine or on Israel and Gaza and stuff like that because that's the part of the world that we're connected to, right? So stuff that goes on in East Asia and places like that doesn't get talked about as much. Or in Africa. It's no less important, certainly more important to the people who are living there, but it doesn't get focused on as much.
We can only hope that the Buddha's message of nonviolence and Ashoka's demonstration of religious pluralism influences minds there. But Theravada was not the only or even the most popular school of Buddhism. As Theravada moved south, another tradition was sweeping through China, where it would help tame the Mongols, create Kung Fu, and help Japan find Zen.
Kung Fu.
Mahayana Buddhism.
All right, we'll come back with that next episode tomorrow, that final episode in this series. Hope you've been enjoying this. I'm learning a lot. I know I'm making a lot of parallels to Christianity and Western religions. It's what I know. It's how I'm able to understand this stuff, is by processing it through what I already know. It's a good exercise to get into because it helps you to understand it better when you're learning new concepts. At least that works for me. So let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below. And before we wrap up and I throw up some links for some other videos for you to check out, just want to give a quick shout out and a thank you to Scott in Worthington, Ohio. Great name, Scott. That's my middle name. And Steve. Steve, I see you in the chat all the time in Levittown, Pennsylvania. Thank you guys so much for your support on Patreon. Couldn't do it without you. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.